The night my father counted me like cash was the night I stopped being his daughter. I remember the sound first. Not shouting, not breaking glass, just the soft, deliberate slide of bills across our kitchen table, the kind of sound that shouldn't mean anything but somehow meant everything. I stood in the doorway, barefoot on cold linoleum, my fingers curled into the fabric of my oversized hoodie like it could anchor me to something that was already gone. My father didn't look at me. He couldn't. Or maybe he chose not to. Either way, it felt the same. That's all of it, he muttered, voice rough, like he'd been up all night arguing with himself and losing. Across from him sat a man who didn't belong in our world. His suit was too clean, too precise, like it had never known dust or desperation. He didn't touch the money right away. He just watched me, not like a man looks at a person, more like he was measuring something, calculating, deciding. My breath caught somewhere between my chest and my throat. "She's the deal?" he asked, calm, controlled, like he was discussing a contract instead of a human life. My father nodded too quickly. "She's all I've got." The words landed heavier than any scream ever could. I waited for him to take it back, to laugh it off, to say it was a joke, a mistake, anything. But he didn't. The man finally reached forward, gathering the money with slow, unhurried movements. Every bill disappeared into his leather briefcase, like pieces of me being filed away. Then he stood, tall, quiet, the kind of presence that didn't need to raise its voice to be heard. When he stepped closer, the air shifted. Not colder, just sharper. "Emily Carter," he said, my name rolling off his tongue like he already owned it. "You're coming with me." I shook my head before I realized I was doing it. A reflex. A last, useless attempt at control. "I'm not." My voice broke, not from fear, but from the realization that no one was going to stop this. Not my father. Not the neighbors. Not the world outside our cracked windows. The man didn't argue. He didn't need to. He just waited. And somehow, that was worse. Because waiting meant he knew how this ended. My father finally looked at me then. Just for a second. Long enough for me to see the regret he'd never act on. Long enough to understand that whatever I had been to him was already gone. I swallowed hard, forcing my feet to move even when every part of me wanted to stay frozen. Because staying didn't mean safety anymore. It meant nothing. As I stepped past him, I realized something I hadn't before. I wasn't being taken. I had already been given away. And the man waiting by the door wasn't just buying a debt. He was buying the rest of my life. I did not remember the walk to the car, only the sound of my own breathing, too loud in my ears, like I was trying to convince myself I was still here, still real, still something more than a transaction that had already been completed. The night air felt colder than it should have been for late September, sharp against my skin as I stepped off the cracked porch and onto the uneven gravel. And I realized with a strange kind of clarity that no one was going to stop me. No one was going to call out. No one was going to say this was wrong, because to everyone who mattered in that moment, this was already settled, already decided. The black car waiting at the curb looked like it had been pulled straight out of a different world, polished to a mirror shine that reflected the broken house behind me in a way that made it look even smaller, even more distant, as if I had already left it behind. The driver opened the door without a word, his movements precise, practiced, like he had done this 100 times before. Maybe he had. Maybe girls like me were not as rare as I wanted to believe. I hesitated for half a second, not because I thought I could run, but because some part of me needed to acknowledge that this was the moment everything changed. Then I slid into the back seat, the leather cool and unfamiliar beneath my hands, the door closing with a soft, final click that sounded louder than anything else that night, sealing something I could not undo. The man followed a second later, sitting across from me instead of beside me, giving me space that somehow felt more controlling than if he had taken it. His presence filled the car without effort, quiet but impossible to ignore. "Seatbelt," he said, not harsh, not demanding, just certain, like it was not a suggestion. My fingers fumbled for it before I could stop myself. The click echoing in the silence between us, the car pulled away from the curb smoothly, like it had been waiting for this exact second. I turned my head just once, looking back at the house that had never really been a home, the porch light flickering, the front door already closed. And for a moment I wondered if my father was still standing at that table, or if he had already moved on, already forgotten. The thought settled somewhere deep and heavy, But it did not break me. Not anymore. I faced forward again, forcing myself not to look back a second time. Because looking back meant hoping, and hope was the one thing I could not afford to carry with me into whatever this was. The city lights blurred past the window as we drove, neon signs and street lamps, stretching into long lines of color that made everything feel unreal, like I had stepped into someone else's life by mistake. "You are not going to try to run," he said after a while, his voice cutting through the quiet without raising it. It was not a question. I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. "Where would I go?" I answered, my voice steadier than I expected. He studied me for a moment, his eyes sharp, searching, like he was trying to find something beneath the surface. Something I had not even figured out yet. Then he nodded once, as if I had confirmed something for him. "Good," he said, leaning back slightly. "That makes this easier." Easier. The word lingered in my mind. Not comforting, not threatening, just final. I swallowed, gathering what little courage I had left. "What happens now?" I asked, because not knowing felt worse than anything he could actually say. He did not answer right away, the silence stretching just long enough to make my chest tighten. Then, calmly, like he was stating a fact that had always existed, he said, "Now, you stay alive." The words settled over me in a way I did not understand. Not yet, because they did not sound like ownership. They sounded like a condition, like a rule, like something bigger than either of us had already been set in motion. And for the first time since I stepped into that car, I realized that whatever I had been sold into, it was not going to be simple, and it was not going to be what I expected. I did not realize how far we had driven until the city changed, the streets widening, the noise fading into something distant and controlled. Like even the chaos knew where it was not welcome. The car slowed as tall iron gates appeared ahead of us, rising out of stone walls that looked older than anything I had ever known, solid and unmoving, like they had been built to keep the world out rather than let anyone in. The gates opened before we even stopped, silent, automatic, as if the car itself had been recognized, as if this place already knew who was arriving. My chest tightened as we passed through, because something about crossing that line felt permanent, like stepping into a space where the rules I understood no longer applied. The driveway stretched long and smooth beneath us, lined with trimmed hedges and low lights that cast a soft glow across the path, and at the end of it stood the house. No, not a house, something larger, something that belonged in magazines I had only ever flipped through at grocery stores, all glass and stone and quiet power, the kind of place that did not need to prove anything because it already had everything. The car came to a stop beneath a covered entrance, and for a moment, no one moved. I stared out the window, trying to process the shift from everything I had known to this, trying to understand how I had gone from a broken kitchen table to this polished silence in less than an hour. The driver stepped out first, opening my door. And again, that same precise, practiced movement, like I was expected, like this was routine. I hesitated, not because I thought I could refuse, but because stepping out meant accepting that this was real, that I was here, that I belonged to whatever this was now. I placed one foot on the smooth concrete, then the other. The night air different here, cleaner somehow, carrying none of the weight I had left behind. The man stepped out after me, adjusting his jacket with a small, controlled motion, then gestured toward the entrance, not touching me, not forcing me, just indicating, and somehow that was enough to make my feet move. Inside, the space opened around me in a way that made me feel smaller than I already did. High ceilings, soft lighting, everything arranged with intention, nothing out of place. I could hear my own footsteps echo faintly against the polished floor, a reminder that I did not belong here. Not yet. Maybe not ever. "You will have a room upstairs," he said, his voice steady behind me. I turned slightly, watching him as he moved through the space like it answered to him. Like every wall, every light, every shadow was part of something he controlled. "You will have clothes, food, anything you need," he continued, pausing just enough for the words to settle. "But you do not leave without permission." There it was, the rule, clear and simple, not raised, not harsh, but absolute. I nodded before I could stop myself, because arguing felt pointless in a place like this, because everything about him made it clear that this was not a negotiation. He studied me for a moment, then added, quieter, "No one here will harm you." The words caught me off guard, not because I believed them immediately, but because they sounded deliberate, like a promise he intended to keep. I swallowed, my voice barely above a whisper. "And you?" I asked, not sure why I needed to hear the answer. He held my gaze, his expression unreadable, but his voice did not waver. "I do not need to." The response lingered in the air between us, not threatening, not reassuring, just honest in a way I did not know how to process. A woman appeared then, older, composed, her posture straight and her expression neutral. She looked at him first, waiting. "Take her upstairs," he said, his tone shifting slightly, more distant, more controlled. Like whatever this moment had been was already over. The woman nodded and turned. "To me, this way," she said gently, and I followed, because there was nothing else to do. As we climbed the stairs, I felt the weight of the house settle around me. Not heavy, not suffocating, but present, like it was watching, like it was learning me the same way he had. And as I stepped into the room that was now mine, larger than anything I had ever called my own, I realized something that made my chest tighten in a way I could not explain. I was not locked in, not physically. There were no bars, no chains, no doors slammed shut behind me. And yet, as I stood there, looking out at a world I could no longer reach, I understood that freedom was not about whether the door was open. It was about whether you had somewhere to go, and for the first time in my life, I did not. I did not sleep that night. Not really. I lay on a bed that felt too soft, too clean, staring at a ceiling that did not have cracks to follow or stains to memorize. And it made my mind louder, not quieter, because there was nothing here that felt familiar enough to hold on to. The silence wrapped around me in a way that was almost unsettling, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. I turned onto my side, then onto my back, then sat up, pulling the blanket tighter around me, even though I was not cold, just trying to create some kind of barrier between me and everything that had changed in a matter of hours. My thoughts kept circling back to one thing, the way he had said it: "You stay alive. Not you stay here, not you behave, not you obey, just alive." Like that was the most important condition of all, and I did not know what to do with that, because it did not fit the story I had already built in my head about what this was supposed to be. Morning came quietly, no alarms, no shouting, no footsteps echoing down a narrow hallway. Just soft light filtering through tall windows that made the room feel almost unreal. I sat up slowly, half expecting someone to be standing at the door, waiting, watching, but there was no one, just the stillness of a place that did not need to rush. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet touching a rug that felt too expensive for someone like me to stand on. And for a second I hesitated, like I was trespassing in a life that was not mine, but then I stood anyway, because staying still was not going to change anything. The clothes laid out on the chair caught my attention, simple but new, nothing flashy, nothing that screamed ownership, just clean, deliberate choices, like someone had thought about what I would be comfortable wearing without asking me. I changed slowly, aware of every movement, every shift in fabric, as if the room might be watching. Even though I knew that was impossible, when I stepped into the hallway, it felt just as quiet as the night before, wide and open, with sunlight stretching across polished floors. I followed the faint sound of movement downstairs, not because I was told to, but because curiosity was stronger than fear in that moment. The kitchen was larger than my entire house had been, bright, organized, everything in its place, and there he was, standing near the counter, sleeves rolled slightly, a cup of coffee in his hand. Like this was just another morning, like nothing about last night had been unusual. He looked up when I entered, his eyes finding mine instantly, sharp, aware, taking in everything. I stopped a few feet away, unsure of the invisible lines I was not supposed to cross. "You found your way," he said, his voice calm, steady, like he had expected this. I nodded, not trusting my voice yet. He gestured toward the counter. "Eat," he added, simple, direct, not a command, but not a suggestion either. I moved closer slowly, noticing the plate already set out, food that looked untouched, like it had been waiting for me. I hesitated again, then sat, picking up the fork with fingers that felt steadier than they had any right to be. The first bite tasted normal, and that was the strangest part, because nothing about this was normal, and yet here I was, sitting in a kitchen that did not belong to me, eating like I had always been here, like I had always been expected. You will have a schedule, he said after a moment, setting his cup down with quiet precision. I looked up, meeting his gaze. Not to control you, he added before I could react. To give you structure. The words settled somewhere deep, confusing and unfamiliar, because no one had ever talked about structure in my life. Only survival. I swallowed, setting the fork down. Why? I asked the question, slipping out before I could stop it. Not just about the schedule, but about all of it, about me, about this, about him. He held my gaze for a long second, something unreadable passing through his expression. Then he said, quietly, because chaos is not something I allow in my house. And for the first time, I realized that maybe I was not the only one who had been shaped by it. The word schedule followed me long after he left the kitchen. It echoed in my mind in a way that felt unfamiliar, almost foreign, because I had never lived a life that moved in straight lines. Everything I knew had been unpredictable, shifting, breaking without warning. But here, in this place, everything seemed to follow an invisible order. I noticed it in the way the staff moved quietly through the house, in the way meals appeared at the same time, in the way the lights adjusted as the day changed. Nothing was rushed, nothing was chaotic, and somehow that made me more uneasy than anything else, because chaos I understood, chaos I could survive. But this controlled calm, felt like stepping into a system I did not know how to navigate. I spent the morning wandering carefully, not aimlessly, but cautiously, as if every step needed to be measured. The house revealed itself in pieces, a living room that looked untouched, a study lined with books that seemed more like a statement than something meant to be read, large windows that let in more light than I was used to. It was too open, too exposed, like there were no corners to hide in, and that realization sat heavy in my chest. I found myself pausing near one of the windows, looking out over the grounds, the long driveway, the gates in the distance, and beyond that, the world I had come from. It felt farther away now, not in miles, but in something harder to define, like a line had been drawn and I was standing on the other side of it. You were trying to understand it. His voice came from behind me, calm, observant, not surprised to find me there. I turned slightly, my shoulders tightening before I could stop it. I am trying to understand what this is, I admitted, because pretending otherwise felt pointless. He stepped closer, not invading my space, but close enough that I could feel the shift in the air again, that quiet authority that seemed to follow him everywhere. This is structure, he said, simply, like the answer should be obvious. I let out a small breath, shaking my head. This is control, I corrected, the words slipping out before I could filter them. His gaze sharpened, not angry, not offended, just focused. Control is what prevents everything else, he replied, and something in his tone made it clear that he was not speaking in general terms. I crossed my arms slightly, grounding myself. And what exactly am I in all of this? I asked, the question that had been sitting just beneath the surface since the moment I stepped into that car. He did not answer right away, his eyes studying me with that same careful calculation, like he was deciding how much truth to give. You are under my protection, he said finally, the words measured, deliberate. I frowned, the response not fitting with anything I expected. That is not what it felt like last night, I said quietly, because protection did not usually start with being traded. He held my gaze, unflinching. Last night was a transaction, he said, not denying it, not softening it. This is something else. The distinction hung between us, incomplete, unexplained. I searched his face for something more, some hint of what he meant, but all I found was that same controlled composure, like whatever answers existed were not ones he was ready to give. You can move freely inside this house, he continued, shifting slightly, as if the conversation had reached a point he had already anticipated. You will have access to anything you need, education, resources, time. The list sounded almost unreal, like he was describing opportunities instead of restrictions. But you do not leave without me. There it was again, the boundary, clear and unyielding. I looked back out the window, the gates standing far in the distance, and for a moment, I wondered if they were meant to keep people out or keep me in. And if I try, I asked softly, not because I planned to, but because I needed to know where the line truly was. He did not hesitate. "You will not get far," he said, not as a threat, but as a certainty. I nodded slowly, absorbing that, understanding that whatever this arrangement was, it came with rules that were not negotiable. But as I stood there, caught between the world I had lost and the one I did not yet understand, I realized something that unsettled me more than anything else. For the first time in my life, I was not thinking about how to escape. I was trying to understand why I had been kept. It started with small things I almost missed because they did not fit the pattern I had prepared myself for. No locked doors, no raised voices, no sudden demands that came out of nowhere. Instead, there was a rhythm to the days, quiet and deliberate. Breakfast at the same time. The same soft knock on my door each morning, even though it was never locked. As if whoever stood on the other side respected a boundary I did not remember setting. I found myself waking before the knock after a few days, my body adjusting to something it had never known before, consistency, and it unsettled me more than fear ever had. Because fear kept you alert, fear gave you purpose, but this calm, made space for thoughts I had spent years avoiding. I began to notice him differently too, not just as the man who had taken me from one life and placed me in another, but as someone who moved through his own world with the same controlled precision that shaped everything around him. He was rarely still, always working, always speaking in low tones on the phone or reviewing documents spread across the desk in the study. Yet every time I entered a room, his attention shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that drew notice, but enough that I felt it, like a subtle change in gravity. One afternoon, I found myself standing at the edge of the study doorway, not intending to interrupt, just observing. He did not look up immediately, but after a few seconds, without turning, he said, "If you are going to stand there, you might as well come in." His voice was calm, almost amused, and it caught me off guard. I stepped inside slowly, unsure why I felt like I had been seen even before he acknowledged me. The room smelled faintly of paper and something darker, something expensive and restrained. "I was not trying to interrupt," I said, my voice quieter than usual. He finally looked up, setting the pen down with measured ease. "You are not," he replied, his gaze steady. I hesitated, then moved closer, drawn by something I could not fully explain. Maybe curiosity, maybe the need to understand the person who now defined the boundaries of my life. "You work a lot," I said, the observation simple, but it felt like stepping onto uncertain ground. He leaned back slightly in his chair, considering me. "I do what is required," he answered, and there was no pride in it, no complaint, just fact. I studied him for a moment, noticing details I had not allowed myself to focus on before. The slight tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes never seemed to fully relax, like even in stillness, he was calculating, anticipating, controlling. "Does it ever stop?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could decide if I should keep it to myself. Something flickered across his expression then, quick, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. "No," he said, simply, and for the first time, there was something in his voice that felt almost honest in a different way, not controlled, not distant, just real. I nodded slowly, not sure why that answer affected me. Maybe because I recognized it, the feeling of never being able to fully step away, of always being braced for what came next. I shifted my weight, glancing around the room again, then back at him. "You said I would have structure," I reminded him. "What does that mean?" He watched me carefully, as if measuring the intent behind the question. "It means you do not spend your days wondering what comes next," he said. "It means you build something instead of reacting to everything." The words settled deeper than I expected, because reacting was all I had ever known. He stood then, moving around the desk with that same quiet authority, stopping a few feet in front of me, not too close, but close enough that I could feel the shift again, that presence that seemed to fill every space he entered. "You will start with classes," he continued. "Online, private, whatever you choose." I blinked, the idea so unexpected it took a second to process. "Classes," I repeated, unsure if I had heard him correctly. He nodded once. "You were not given options before," he said, his tone even now. "You have them." I stared at him, trying to reconcile the man who had been part of a transaction with the one standing in front of me offering something that looked dangerously close to opportunity. And for the first time since I arrived, something shifted inside me. Not fear, not resistance, but something quieter, something unfamiliar, like the smallest possibility that this was not just about being kept, but about becoming something I had never been allowed to be before. The first time I opened the laptop they gave me, my hands hesitated over the keyboard like it might disappear if I touched it too quickly, the screen glowing softly in the quiet of my room. Waiting, patient, offering something I did not know how to accept without questioning it. Classes, he had said it so simply, like it was an obvious next step, like it had always been part of the plan. I clicked through the options slowly, reading each description more than once, not because I did not understand the words, but because I did not understand why they were being offered to me. Choices had never been something I was given. They were something I watched other people have, something I adapted around, something I survived without. And now here they were, lined up in front of me like they had been waiting. I selected one without overthinking it, afraid that if I took too long, I would convince myself this was not real. The days began to shift after that, not dramatically, but enough that I could feel it. Mornings were no longer just something to get through. They had direction, structure. The word he used echoing in my mind as I followed a routine that slowly started to feel like it belonged to me. Not forced, not imposed, but chosen. And that difference mattered more than I expected. I found myself sitting at the desk by the window more often. The same window I had once stood in front of wondering where I could go. Now looking out without the same urgency to leave. Not because the gates had disappeared, but because something inside me had changed. I was not counting distance anymore. I was counting progress. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there, and it scared me in a different way, because it meant I was adapting, and adapting meant I was no longer just waiting for a way out. I was building something within the walls I had once resented. I did not see him as often during the day, but I felt his presence in everything, in the way things were arranged, in the quiet efficiency of the house, in the fact that nothing interrupted the routine that was now becoming mine. Until one evening when the rhythm broke, not loudly, not in a way that anyone else would notice, but I felt it immediately. The air shifted, heavier, sharper, like something unseen had entered the space. I was in the study again, reviewing notes, when voices carried faintly from the hallway, lower than usual, more controlled. I did not move closer. I did not need to. I had already learned that the house spoke in ways that did not require volume. The door opened a moment later, and he stepped inside, his expression the same, composed, unreadable, but something in his posture was different, tighter, more alert. His eyes found me instantly, assessing, confirming, like he needed to see that I was still exactly where I was supposed to be. "You should stay in your room tonight," he said, his tone calm. But there was no room for interpretation. My stomach tightened, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because this was the first time the structure had shifted without explanation. "What is happening?" I asked, standing slowly. He paused for a fraction of a second, then shook his head slightly. "Nothing that concerns you." The answer came too quickly, too precise, and it told me more than he intended. I held his gaze, something in me resisting the instinct to simply nod and obey. "You said I was under your protection," I reminded him, my voice steadier than I felt. "That means it concerns me." His eyes sharpened at that, not with anger, but with something closer to recognition, like he had not expected me to say that. The silence stretched between us for a moment. Then he stepped closer, stopping just short of crossing that invisible line he always seemed to respect. "It means you are safe," he corrected, his voice lower now, more deliberate. "And right now, safety means staying out of what does not belong to you." The words settled heavily, not dismissive, but firm. I exhaled slowly, realizing that whatever this was, it was something I could not step into. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But as he turned to leave, he hesitated for just a second, his voice quieter when he spoke again. "Lock your door," he added, and that, more than anything else, made my chest tighten, because for the first time since I arrived, he was not just setting a rule, he was acknowledging that something beyond these walls could reach inside. And as the door closed behind him, I stood there in the silence, understanding one thing with absolute clarity. This place was not just protecting me from the world, it was protecting me from a part of his world that I had not yet seen. I locked the door the second his footsteps disappeared down the hallway. The soft click louder than it should have been, like it carried more weight than just wood meeting metal. I stood there for a moment with my hand still resting against the handle, waiting, listening. But the house did not erupt into chaos. It did not fill with noise or panic. It remained exactly as it always was, quiet, controlled, almost indifferent, and somehow that made everything feel more real, because whatever had shifted was not something this place reacted to openly. It was something it absorbed, contained, managed without breaking its rhythm. I stepped back slowly, my eyes scanning the room as if I might see something different, something out of place, but everything looked the same. The bed untouched, the desk by the window, the faint glow of the laptop screen still open from earlier. The normalcy felt almost staged, like a carefully maintained illusion. I moved toward the window, instinct pulling me there, but the view outside offered nothing new. The gates still stood in the distance, the ground still empty, the night still calm, and yet I could feel it, something just beyond what I could see, something that made the air feel heavier. I wrapped my arms around myself, not out of cold, but to steady the tension that had settled under my skin. Time moved differently that night, slower, stretched, every minute feeling longer than it should have been. I tried to focus on anything else, the class material on my screen, the notes I had started earlier, but my mind kept drifting back to the way he had said it. Not urgent, not afraid. Just certain, like he had already accounted for whatever was happening. Like this was not unexpected, just inconvenient. Hours passed. Or maybe it was less. I could not tell anymore, until the silence shifted again, not louder, just different, like a current changing direction. I froze for a second, listening, then moved toward the door before I could stop myself, my hand hovering over the lock. The memory of his voice clear, lock your door, but something else pushed forward, something stronger. Then obedience. I unlocked it slowly, the mechanism turning with a soft click, and opened the door just enough to see the hallway. It looked the same, empty, still, but the air carried a tension that had not been there before. I stepped out carefully, my bare feet silent against the floor, following the faint pull of something I could not name, until I saw him at the far end of the hall, standing near the staircase, his back partially turned, speaking quietly to one of the men who had been with him the night I arrived. I could not hear the words, but I could see the way his posture held, steady but alert, like a line drawn that would not be crossed easily. He noticed me before I realized it, his head turning slightly, his eyes finding me instantly. And in that moment, something shifted again, not in the house, not in the air, but in him. He ended the conversation without another word, the other man stepping away immediately, leaving just the two of us in the long stretch of hallway. I told you to stay in your room, he said, his voice calm but firmer than before. I swallowed, stepping forward despite the tension pressing against my chest. And I told you I needed to understand, I replied, the words coming out steadier than I expected. His gaze held mine, sharp, measuring, but there was something else there too, something quieter, something that looked almost like hesitation, which made no sense, because nothing about him suggested uncertainty. This is not your concern, he said again, but this time, it sounded less like a dismissal and more like a boundary he was trying to maintain. I took another step closer, the distance between us shrinking just enough that I could see the faint tension in his jaw, the way his eyes flicked briefly toward the stairs before returning to me. Then why does it feel like it is? I asked softly. Because it did, because whatever this was, it had already reached into my space, into my thoughts, into the fragile sense of control I had started to build. He exhaled slowly, a small, controlled release that felt more revealing than anything he had said so far. Because you are here, he answered finally, and the simplicity of it landed heavier than anything else, because it meant that being here, being part of this, came with things I could not see, things I could not prepare for, things that would touch my life whether I wanted them to or not. He stepped closer then, closing the distance just enough to make his presence unmistakable, but still respecting that invisible line. Go back to your room, he said, quieter now, not a command, but something closer to a request, and for the first time since I met him, I heard something beneath the control, something that sounded almost like concern, and as I stood there, caught between the instinct to push further and the realization that I was standing at the edge of something far bigger than I understood, I finally stepped back, turning toward my room, not because I was afraid, but because I was beginning to understand that whatever this was, It was not just his world I had stepped into, it was something that was already beginning to shape mine. I did not sleep much after that, not because I was afraid, but because something inside me had shifted too far to settle back into silence. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling again, but this time it was different, not empty, not numb. My mind was working, connecting pieces I had not wanted to see before. He had not lied to me, not once. Everything he said had been precise, controlled, chosen, and that was what unsettled me the most, because it meant whatever I was part of now was not built on chaos. It was built on intention, and intention meant purpose. Morning came slowly, softer than the night had been, but the tension did not disappear. It lingered just beneath the surface, like something unresolved. I got up anyway, following the routine that had already begun to shape my days, because structure was the one thing that did not change. Even when everything else did, the house felt the same, quiet, composed. But I noticed the details now. The way the staff moved with more awareness, the way conversations were shorter, more contained, like everyone was adjusting to something without acknowledging it. I moved through the space carefully, not out of fear, but out of understanding. I was beginning to see that this world had layers, and I had only been standing on the surface. I found him in the study again, like I always did when I needed answers. Except this time he was not working. He was standing by the window, looking out at the same view I had stared at so many times. But his posture was different, still controlled, but heavier somehow, like the weight of something unseen had settled on his shoulders. He turned when I entered, his eyes finding me immediately, and for a second, neither of us spoke, because the silence between us was no longer empty. It was full of everything that had gone unsaid the night before. Is it over? I asked finally, my voice steady, not demanding, just searching. He held my gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. For now, he said, and the answer felt honest in a way I had come to recognize, not comforting, but real. I stepped closer, closing the distance just enough to stand beside him, looking out at the same view, the gates, the long stretch of driveway, the world beyond that I had once thought I needed to return to. But now, standing there, it did not feel the same. It felt smaller somehow, less certain. You said I am here because of a transaction, I continued, the words coming easier now, less restrained. But everything after that does not feel like one. He did not respond immediately, his eyes shifting slightly, not avoiding the question, but considering it, like he was deciding how much to give me. That is because it is not, he said finally, his voice lower than usual, more deliberate. I turned to look at him, searching for something deeper in his expression. Then what is it? I asked, and this time, the question carried everything I had been trying to understand since the moment I stepped into that car. He met my gaze fully, no distance, no deflection, just direct, unwavering presence. It is a choice, he said, and the words landed in a way that made my breath catch, because they changed everything. A transaction could be undone, forgotten, replaced, but a choice meant intention, meant meaning, meant something that extended beyond obligation. I shook my head slightly, not in disagreement, but in disbelief. You did not have to take me, I said quietly. You could have walked away, he nodded once, acknowledging that truth without hesitation. I could have, he agreed, and there was no pride in it, no need to justify it, just fact. I swallowed, the weight of that settling deeper than anything else he had said. So why did you not? I asked, because that was the only question that mattered now, the only one that could make sense of everything that had happened since that night. He exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting for just a moment, not away from me, but inward, like he was looking at something he did not often revisit. Because I recognized something, he said, his voice quieter now, less controlled, more human. I waited, my chest tightening slightly. What? I pressed gently. He looked back at me then, and for the first time, there was no distance in his expression, no barrier, just clarity. Someone who had never been given a chance, he said, and the simplicity of it hit harder than anything else could have, because it was not about ownership, not about control, not even about protection. It was about something I had never expected to hear from him. Understanding. I stood there in silence, the weight of his words settling into something deeper than I could immediately process. Because for the first time in my life, I was not being defined by what had been taken from me. but by what I might become, and as I looked out at the world beyond the gates, I realized something that felt both terrifying and freeing at the same time. I was no longer waiting to be saved. I was standing in the middle of a choice, one that had been made for me at first, but was now slowly becoming my own. And maybe, just maybe, that was what he had meant all along. Not that I belonged to him, but that I finally belonged to a life where I had the power to choose who I would become.